Head on Fire is a Patreon-supported podcast. Supporters of the show get early access to audio and video content, episode archives, monthly roundtables, a book club, and more. All benefits are offered on a sliding scale, so no matter your level of donation, you never miss out. If you like this show, consider supporting it with $1 a month or whatever you can at patreon.com/headonfirepod. Thanks, and enjoy the show. The last couple of years have forced many of us to have uncomfortable conversations with ourselves about the way that we live, about where we live, about how we live. We are reprioritizing and reorienting our lives to spend the time that we have with the people that we want to spend it with the most, our loved ones, our friends, our family. We are smack dab in the middle of a years-long worldwide pandemic, and because of that, so many of us are asking questions about the ways in which we live. But we're also beginning to have conversations about the ways in which we die. My guest today hopes to help facilitate some of those conversations. Mahlakai Rose is a death educator, a death doula, a coach, an advocate, and one of the founders of the House of Grief. Before we get going, a quick content warning. This episode does contain some heavy conversation, touching on topics not just about death, but about sexual assault and abuse. If those are triggering issues for you, listen with care. Get out a notepad and something good to drink. You're going to want to take notes. Here's Mahlakai Rose. Mahlakai Rose, thank you so much for being here today. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, Mal, thank you so much for being here. So you are professionally what is known as a death doula. And I think for a lot of people, that is a term that will be very new for them. So for folks that have never heard that term before, or might have heard that term and not quite sure what that means, why don't you tell folks a little bit about yourself and the concept of a death doula?
Okay, well, let's start with the concept of a death doula here, because it's so funny. It's like working in it. I'm so used to seeing it everywhere, and I know all the like little niche pockets of where it's found, and then I forget that it's actually not that well known still. It's still something that's, it's growing exponentially, but it's still not huge out there. So I have to like take a step back and be like, oh yeah, I have to define this for people. But being a death doula is something that's both extremely old and kind of going through a modern resurgence. And I think the best way to put it, sometimes people call it as an end of life doula, a death midwife, which kind of gives you the idea of, there's midwives for bringing babies into the world, and there's midwives for bringing people out of the world. But that's not all death doulas are. And actually, there's a kind of common misconception that all death doulas sit bedside and only deal with people who are physically dying in a very specific way, that they can have someone to sit bedside and can be with them all the way through. And that's simply not true. So I'm going to redefine death doula for you in a way that we can kind of explore the nuance of what this industry is, because it's actually quite robust at this point. And it's so robust that we're already evolving within ourselves. And we've got death doulas like pushing boundaries and rocking boats and being like, let's do something different. It's wicked. It's so cool what's happening in here. So a death doula is someone who provides non-medical, and that's a really important thing, holistic care, which means mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical, for people who are grappling with death, mortality, and essentially the finite nature of all things. And that's the way I'm going to define it. And so that means that there are people who, we totally sit bedside. And, you might find more of those if you specifically look up end of life doula. And there's lots of associations, end of life doula associations. There's INELDA, the International End of Life Doula Association, for people who are helping you sit bedside or plan your physical death, work with things around physical death. They're there. They can help with that. And then there's also doulas who don't sit bedside, who help you work with the ideas and concepts of death and mortality, and again, the finite nature of all things, before you actually hit the 11th hour of death, before you have a terminal illness, before you're aware of anything chronic that might cause you to, if you're basically what I like to call an everyday dyer, you're here, you're living, and also you're dying, because every day we're dying a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the two realms we work in, the everyday dyer realm and the 11th hour, here we go.
So you run an organization called the House of Grief, which seeks to, I like this phrase that you have, relationship recomposition. In talking to you, you said that, a lot of what you do is reorient people's relationship to one another. Is that death isn't simply just someone leaving; it's a change in relationship. What is relationship recomposition?
Recomposing relationships is kind of it's a framework I developed to help people understand how to grieve and how to use grief to connect with each other in a different way. Because, a lot of the frameworks that we have surrounding grief, like 5 stages of grief, weren't to poor Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, were not used properly from the beginning. I'm sorry, Elizabeth, we done you dirty. But now they're also just outdated and not really serving the sphere anymore. And there's not a lot of people you talk to, especially people who've had someone die, who are like, yeah, the 5 stages of grief, that totally worked for me. It's just not helping at this point. So I kind of developed my own framework to work with grief and death in a new way. And for me, it was actually inspired by baking. I love baking shows. Fun fact about me, I love Great British Bake Off and watching baking shows. And they do this thing where they like recompose cookies and stuff. So it's like we have a chocolate chip cookie, and then we take the chocolate chip cookie and we break it up through this machine. And now it's going to be the base crumb for a fine domed mousse, And it's still a chocolate chip cookie. It has all the components of chocolate chip cookie, but it's in a completely new form. So that's essentially what we do with our relationships when someone either physically dies, or when we experience a breakup, or when we do anything in our lives that there's a change, is our relationship recomposes. All the components of that relationship are still there, but the form in which the relationship is going to take is now going to look different. So somebody physically dies. Your relationship doesn't end. It just means that you still have a relationship with them, but maybe you're talking to them at an altar space. Maybe you're wearing their sweater every Saturday. But you don't really get the same I get to hug you relationship that you had before. But it's not like the memories or anything else about that relationship changes.
I really love the metaphor that you used of the cookie, and of how the fact that the cookie is destroyed, the fact that the cookie, let's use the word dies, the cookie dies, but then the remnants of that cookie are then reconstituted and used to form the base of something new. So in a way, the relationship, that emotional framework that you had, then can help support, inform, or challenge another relationship or some other aspect of your life. So yes. It is, I didn't get that at first. I didn't quite, I'll be honest, we've talked before, and I didn't quite grok the idea of relationship recomposition, but the idea that you can take that, break it down and have that emotional connection, that energy, that framework that you had with this person, and use it to build something else, or build up another part of yourself, or create something new. Wow. Wow.
I know, you know what? Honestly, I don't blame you for not getting it initially. Like, I'm okay. I am essentially a really intense researcher who spends most of my time in a corner of my room digging into everything and putting it all together in this freaky web where I've got like the yarn stretched between pins, putting it all together for how death works in life. So like, I'm just starting to learn how to come out and be like, okay, y'all, let me explain this to you. We got something to talk about,
So I think that it would be remiss in a conversation like this if we don't talk about, when somebody starts looking into a death doula, what a death doula is. You mentioned earlier that there are death doulas that sit bedside, that are there,
Yeah.
brought in
Yes, they
when
are.
you or a loved one is on their way to a transition point, to put it
Mm-hmm.
gently, I guess.
Yeah,
That they
don't
are
put it
on their
gently. They're
deathbed, that
gonna
they
die.
are,
That's where they're
yeah,
going.
they're going to die. And so, from my understanding and shaky research into the field of death doulas, is that you all are brought in to prepare not only the family, but prepare the person for transition, prepare the person for death, not just emotionally, not just this relationship recomposition, but also just the
Mm-hmm.
physical act of dying, what happens with the body after, and then even beyond after that. But am I right here? What does that process look like?
Okay, so, I think it's really important here to talk about the difference between a death doula and, say, like a hospice nurse or a mortician.
Mm-hmm.
Hospice nurses, and probably mortician most of all, are all up in the body. Like, their body care is their jam. It is their responsibility to make sure that symptoms are managed and that the physical body
Mm-hmm.
is well cared for on its way to the nth degree that it's about to get to, the final death, the final breath. Um, with a doula, our job is essentially to be more of an advocate when it comes to physical bodies. We're there to advocate. So we're there to make sure the
Mm.
nurse is doing their job. We're there to make sure that, when there's extra mucus in your person's throat while they're dying, that that there is a machine that you can ask for to help suction that out and make them more comfortable, and that they're going
Mm.
to provide that to you. Like, we know those little nuances to help make sure that that happens. We're there to advocate for, it also depends a little bit on who we're hired by. So I'm going to put that caveat in there, because we could be
Mm.
hired by the family or we could be hired by the dying person. But it's our
Mm.
job to advocate for the dying person's, body wishes. Like, if they don't want to be put on life support, we need to make sure that they have a plan in place, ideally beforehand, to make sure that that doesn't happen, to help them um, just voice what they need when they're dying, like, to help the family know that, bring some lip gloss because their lips might get dry. And we talked about this before, like, the best lip gloss is definitely their favorite lip gloss. And if that doesn't work, you can use Vaseline, but not if they're on oxygen, because then that's a hazard. Anyway, there you go, guys. But to make sure to bring, their favorite blanket if you can, to know the hospital's rules and nuances and deal with all that stuff. Because you know what? When you're going through the physical death of your own body, or your family is going through the physical death of your body, ain't nobody got time for all the stupid little details and legalities and nuances. Doulas, the main difference between hospice nurses and doulas is that
Yes.
doulas are advocates. So we are there to um, basically give you information and advocate for the wishes of the person who is dying when it comes to the physical body. Because we were just talking about end of life care and what happens with doulas who do sit bedside and are there for the physical body. Yeah, we advocate. So we essentially are supposed to gather and or have all the knowledge to help you make choices and know just what choices that you even have in that scenario. Because a lot of people don't know what their choices are. And even if you did before, once you're actually in the moment, like, nobody has time to think about all the little nitpicky details, or to remember all the things you're supposed to remember when you're in the middle of having a really big emotional impact for everything that's going on, right? It's hard to focus. Your brain doesn't work the same
Well, and
anymore.
I think that we're just kind of conditioned to think that, well, death is going to happen later. It
Yes.
doesn't matter how old you are. I mean, it's later. Like, talking to my grandmother in the last few years before she died last year. I mean, whenever she thought she was going to die, it was later. It was
Yes.
Much later. We think of ourselves as old, and I think once we age, we're still not old in our heads. So we just don't think it's time. I think so few of us are just truly ready, which is why I think that what you do is so impactful, because you do at least kind of help people get ready.
Yeah, and that's a big reason why there's doulas that focus solely on working with the everyday dyers. I love that term. I'll use it 90 more times in this interview. Is because, if you work with, your end of life planning and stuff beforehand, it really does make the process so much easier when you actually get there. And also it doesn't mean that just when you work on your end of life plan, let's say you go through the whole process with a doula. Hey, you get a doula, you go through end of life planning, you know what you want to do for your funeral. I've booked with my doula all the details of my beautiful bookstore / cafe and community garden that I want to have when I die. And, I know that I don't want to be on end of life support. I know that I don't want to be put in the ground in formaldehyde. I know that I have all these details sussed out for myself. Um, it's not like it's just over then. You kind of have to keep reassessing it every year over year, because your ideas about yourself are going to change. Your ideas about what you might want in the process of death might change. The circumstances that you're in might change entirely. Like how you die really plays into what you might want for your body, because the body dies differently depending on what's happening to it, right? Like there's a big difference between you dying from aging and you dying from a brain tumor. Like your body might react differently. So for example, there might be more fluid and mucus that happens with your body. There might be more pain leading up to the moment where you're taking your final breaths. There might be other things that go on. So that's also something that a doula can work with, is helping you find information of what might happen in those cases, and how you might want to shift your end of life plans based on that, or help you do it. We're just there to walk with you and basically be the brain for all the things that you don't have time to think about, because you're really in your mental and emotional experience of death. And we're also, again, there to help you with the mental and emotional experience. And I think that's the biggest thing that a doula does. Is
So
yeah.
I'm curious, because I know that you said, obviously you don't take the place of a hospice nurse. Obviously, you're not taking the place of doctors or medical practitioners, but there is specialized certifications that you all do get. And they can vary state to state, but what goes into the certification? What is the certification? Do you have a certification?
Oh God. Okay. I have a beef with certifications. Okay. I'm going to get super real with you all. Certifications for being an end of life doula are both entirely meaningless and extremely useful at the same time.
But
mostly because
I feel the same way about every bachelor's degree.
Right. Thank you.
Every bachelor's degree is just, it's completely meaningless, and it's very useful, because everybody's like, well, I need to see that little checkbox. You need to see that you did it. I'm like, and it's useless. It's the most useless thing. Anyway, sorry.
No, it's real. Oh my God, I could go on about that. We could have a whole kiki on it. Anyway, so the thing is, it's useful depending on where you get it from. There is no overarching legal body for end of life doulas, and that's both a boon and a detriment, because it means anybody and their dog can come up with an end of life doula certification and teach end of life doulaship, which means we could have people coming in there and teaching, oh yeah, when you're an end of life doula, it means that you're converting people to Jesus so they can go to heaven before they die, and you're forcing your religion on other people. It's not that heaven and Jesus aren't bad in end of life. It's just that forcing your religion on another person and trying to convert them in the 11th hour is probably not the way to go,
Yeah, I can't imagine the stress that would come over me or my family if I am just trying to make peace with the fact that I am not going to be here very soon. And all of the physical and spiritual and psychological and emotional ramifications of that truth. And then you come and say, oh, by the way, bestie, let's talk about converting your immortal soul. And I'm like, I cannot imagine the stress of then trying to go through that and that roller
Yeah.
coaster.
Yeah, exactly. And there were people who initially started out the end of life doula framework and the end of life care framework. And one of their biggest things that they started out, which for the most part is present in most doula trainings, is this one really important piece of information which changes the doula model of care and differentiates it from pretty much anything else. And it's this: we don't make decisions for you. We do not
Mm-hmm.
paint your experience with our experience to the best of our ability. We are there to ask you open-ended questions. We are there to help you facilitate a conversation between yourself and your emotions, experiences, and ideas, between you and your relationships. We are there to let you be you and allow you to have whatever experience you're having, regardless of how many taboos are a part of it. We're there to make that happen and facilitate that happening. We're there to remove obstacles to your own experience, but that's not to say that because there's not an overarching legal body that it can't happen, that you get a certification course that tells you the opposite,
Mm-hmm.
or that teaches you to do things that aren't great. Now,
So what was your own training like? I guess I should ask.
yeah, so my own training is it's just such a funny thing because I got my own training just from a little community college here in Canada in BC. It's Douglas College. And I wanted to do this really in-depth training, which is it's actually kind of a brutal training because this is supposed to be a course that probably could be stretched out for many, 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 many months because there's so many topics that come up with death, right? And they only gave permission for those teachers to teach within a 2-week time frame. And it's because of their own not really supporting it while
Mm-hmm.
simultaneously supporting it thing. It's bureaucratic bullshit. But anyway, my teacher did a fucking brilliant job squeezing everything. We literally went 8 to 10 hours a day, all of us deep diving, ripping through topics and emotional experiences together. Me and this group of people who all have our own connections with death, learning about everything from legalities to grief, which I love that they included grief in, because here's the thing: grief is not included in a lot of end-of-life doula certifications. And if you are an aspiring end-of-life doula listening to this podcast right now, I want to give you a major fucking tip. Here it is. I'm swearing about it because I feel that passionately. Excuse my language. It's this: go learn about grief. Do not separate death from grief as two totally different experiences, because even if you are with someone who is dying, the dying person is not dying. They are grieving. They are grieving their relationship to their body. They are grieving their relationship to their family. They are grieving their relationship to the entirety of this world. Go learn about properly supporting grief. And
That
also, if you're
relationship
gonna,
recomposition you were
yes,
talking about.
exactly. Everything is grief.
I'm never gonna look at a cookie crust the same way again. I'm like, I am
Yes, you are.
recompositing my relationship with this cookie.
Yes, that's the whole thing. Everything is grief, because grief isn't really, this is a thing again that I'm bringing into my work, like relationship recomposition. That's my framework. And I would love for people to just rip it off and take it everywhere. Cause I mean, good. It's doing its job. But my thing with grief is that we define currently grief as a feeling. It's a feeling made of feelings. It's a big shablam, a big bomb going off of a whole bunch of different feelings, all experienced at once in no particular order. Again, coming back to that 5 stages of grief, it's not linear. Oh my God, blow it up. Just happening in our body and happening at us and to us. But I actually define your grief differently. I define grief as a practice, because when we define grief as a practice instead of just a set of feelings, it also tells us that there are things it immediately informs us that there are things that we can do to support our own grief and also to support other people through grief. It also tells us that it's not going to end. We say feelings end, they come, you're happy one moment, you're sad the next, whatever. But when you say it's a practice, it's something that you're now committing to working with for the rest of your life, because you are. And you also have no choice in it. You're committing to working with grief for the rest of your life. So it's going to be a practice. It's going to be something you're going to have a very deep relationship with. There can be rituals and routines around it. You're not left drowning in a sea of things.
I do want to ask some practical questions that I just feel like a listener is going to want to come away
Please.
from this interview with. So when you're doing your training, does the training include, I mean, obviously it was very truncated, and I understand that
Yes,
some sort of,
it's
I mean,
true.
so for people that are going, holy crap, how can you do this big major thing with so little training? Let me just tell you, for example, in the financial world, there are tests called like the Series 7 or Series 66 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if you pass this test, you can then invest people's money. And you that's it. All you have to do is pass this test, and you could just study over a weekend if you really want to. It's a really, really, really
Yes.
hard test. Most people take months and months and months to study for it, but still, you don't have to have a degree to get it. You don't. You just have to pass this test. It's kind of like almost
Right.
the bar exam in law school. I mean, all you technically have to do to technically be a lawyer or technically be,
Yes.
and I just don't think that people quite realize how many career paths there are out there that are incredibly specialized and require, or that we assume that requires a lot of experience and dedication and degrees and years and years and years of experience, that really it's just a piece of paper. And the difference between a really good one and a really bad one is what they do after they get their piece of paper.
Yep.
So I just, I feel like there might be people that are like, wait, that's it? That's all you have to do? I'm like, you just don't quite understand how many jobs are out there that are just, the difference between you and that person is a piece of paper, and that piece of paper is not that hard to get. Anyways, but that being said, so while you did your training, I know it was very truncated. Did the training include like practical involvement? Like, are you going to a bedside during this training? Like, was there a family that was willing to let you all? It's sort of like what is that, like a training hospital or something? Like, where are
Oh
you
God,
allowed to
yeah.
sit bedside? Like, is that part of that training or no?
No, it's not I think there actually do exist some trainings where that's possible, where they've built relationships with families where that's possible, but ultimately no, because it's such an intimate experience.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't want to just grab any doula. You want to actually form a relationship with your doula and know what they're about, and they're going to be with you for a while, right? Like, you're not just going to jump in there. And it would feel, it's kind of like, if you're going in for an incredibly major heart surgery and they're like, by the way, there's going to be like 80 students watching you, you don't actually feel very comfortable with that. And if you actually had the choice to say no, you would, which is why they have you sign a paper in the hospital that says that you're going to waive your rights to say no in order to get that surgery, which they do in Canada. I had that happen. That's fun. But, what they do try and do is give you as much personal stories and experience as possible. Like, for example, my teacher just was like, I'm going to tell you all my shittiest experiences and all my most vulnerable moments. I'm going to tell you all the things that you are not going to learn in a book, any book. I'm going to show you videos that I've been digging up for learning about people going through these experiences and what they wish they knew, and what a doula could step in to do. We're going to talk about them in case studies. And we're going to be like, okay, here's your case. What would you do in this case? And talk about, what comes out of it. I think the best thing we can do is the case studies that we did. But yeah, it's just continual learning after that. It's surprising. Most doulas actually who come into training is because they've already done the whole stand by a dead body or had some sort of big physical experience with death. Like, one of the most common stories for people who are coming into end of life doula ship is that they had a loved one pass away and they didn't feel like they got the care that that loved one deserved. And so they want a better standard of care, and they got inspired to follow that better standard of care. And part of their working with a new recomposed relationship with their loved one is to be motivated to go and do that with this newfound purpose to help other people find a better standard of care in death. There's also the people who, had really complicated relationships with with death and are coming in to kind of find out more. And I think this is when I want to bring this up for anybody who's listening to this who's an aspiring doula, which a lot of people are. And honestly, I personally think that if death doulas are doing their jobs right, especially when it comes to bedside and end of life care, we'll actually make ourselves obsolete to a degree, because every single person should know how to do this. And I'm at one point, so many people knew how to do this. Like, this isn't a new thing. Like, back in the day, we didn't have funeral homes and this big funeral industry. This was all things done by families, you know. And it wasn't until essentially colonization that a lot of these rituals, routines, spiritual beliefs, supports, and knowledge of even physical body care got taken away from the home and put in the hands of hospitals, funeral homes, and other places. So, if we're doing end of life doulaship care and this movement properly, I hope one day we become obsolete at the bedside, at least at the bedside, or mostly obsolete. Um,
Can I ask then, so what was, I mean, what was that first time like? So you get through your practical training, you get your piece of paper, and then
mm-hmm.
what was your first experience like? What was your first experience like there being bedside and being part of that transition?
You know what? I would actually love to tell you about my hardest experience.
Sure.
My hardest experience didn't even involve a human person. It was actually a cat.
Oh
Um,
gosh.
so I got called in. I had literally just gotten my official certificate, whatever you want to call that for, which basically just means I just did the certificate honestly because I wanted to know more about the legalities, because that's the area of knowledge that I was really lacking in, was Canada's legalities, the US's legalities. So I went to do it for that purpose. But it was literally just after, and there was a friend, acquaintance of mine, who their cat got hit by a car. That their cat that they'd had for a very long time. And again, I'm going to remind people about the beginning of this interview about hierarchies of loss and not putting things on hierarchies of loss and being like, really, a cat? Like, okay, take a moment, take a breath, examine, why we're putting that on a hierarchy. This was a big loss for this person. I'm going to treat it as such. And I was called in to hold space for them, like literally immediately after it happened. They had sat in the street with their cat bleeding in their arms, and passing away. And they had literally just gotten home. They were shaking, and they had the body in a box. And they were just like, I can't do this right now. I need help. Which is sometimes how it happens. Like, even for end of life doulas, it's not like we're sitting pretty vigils all the time. If you're sitting bedside, like, people die suddenly. In fact, it almost makes me mad when we define end of life doulas as just these people who come and sit bedside with you, because that it X's off this entire range of how deaths happen. Like, yes, how death applies to life and everyday dyers, different losses, how we process loss, and all the other types of physical death there are out there, like murder or suicide or just somebody suddenly having a heart attack and they're gone. Like, there's so many ways that death happens that when we think of death doulas as only sitting bedside, you think that you won't call for them for any other reason. And that's not true. There's so many reasons to call for a death doula, even as you sit here listening to this podcast thinking that you're in perfect health. Like, there's so many reasons. But anyway, yeah, I went there, and I was honestly in the middle of eating food. I just got a call and I was like, still had food in my mouth. I'm like, hey. And then they're like, this happened. I'm like, oh shit. And I like actually spit out some of the food from my mouth, and I just put my bowl away, and I packed my bag full of different herbs, because I knew that this person, I happened to know their spirituality. So I packed up as much as I could that was pertaining to that and brought it over their house. And they answered the door and they were like, hi. And then that's when things got hard, because everything was so quiet and still and slow. And that's the hardest part. The slow is the hardest part. You think if you're an end of life doula, you're going to come in, you're going to have these plans, you're going to be go, go, go and making things happen, advocating left, right, and center, because that's what our society does. Hey, we're all in this grind culture, hustle, hustle, hustle. There ain't no hustle in a death situation or with a grief situation or a loss situation. It's learning how to slow yourself down. And if you're thinking, what slow means in your head right now while you're listening to this podcast, slower than that. Like, let's go all the way slow, because you have to be so utterly and completely present in that moment. I didn't even know what presence meant. Like, I did tons of meditations on presence. I did not know what presence meant until I was really standing in that room where everything slowed down that far. And I had to just watch for the subtlest body language change, a subtle shift in language to know the difference between, now my friend wants to share a story about their cat, and, oh, now they actually want to back up from it. And then now's a good time for me to just sit with them. And now's a good moment for me to put my hand on their lap and hold hands with them. Oh, now I notice that they're probably going to cry. There's a big cry coming. How can I help facilitate this? And it's so epically snail paced. It's like the whole world stops and you're just there in that moment. And that's the hardest part about death and grief that I think I've still encountered, is the slowness of it. And it's also the thing that my clients struggle with the most, is the slowness. And
can I ask how you separate how you, Mal, would respond to someone's grief and how the house of grief responds to grief? Because whenever we as people are faced with someone's sadness or someone's strong emotion or something like that, we tend to try to empathize, and sometimes that can cause us to center ourselves. You've lost a cat. Oh my gosh, I lost my dog last year. I understand. This is terrible. But the thing is, even in that moment, there's a moment where it's about your dead dog. It's not about their dead cat. And as well-meaning as we can be, we do at least insert ourselves in the story of someone else's grief momentarily. But it is very human to do that. I understand that that's just sort of how we're conditioned to relate to one another. And I understand that. And I don't want to discourage people from having human reactions. But how do you respond to grief? And then I think I want to ask, what do you do after? How do you decompress? Are you in therapy? Are you okay? Do you like, what do you do? Because you've been carrying other people's grief, or at least channeling it for people. What do you do? How do you decompress? So, how do you come into it and how do you leave it?
Okay, so this is where my story diverges from maybe what the typical advice of a doula would be, or the typical experience might be. And again, I'm typifying you all. I'm sorry, fellow doulas. I'm sure you all have incredibly unique experiences and big things. And also, thank you for your work. I love you all, even if we disagree, because we're all a part of the same movement in some way. And I really, there's a great raising up of other doulas that happens in this industry, and it's fucking awesome. But here's where I have to get like really vulnerable with you and tell you about why I'm a doula. Because how I respond as Mal and how the house of grief responds is the same, because the house of grief was built out of what I felt was missing from these experiences, and what I would hope to have responded to, what I wish people responded to me with, and what I wanted to respond to other people with. And this is because of this. I didn't come into being a doula because somebody I loved died. And also, I'd like to say, if somebody you don't love dies, you still need to grieve that. Just side tip. We always disenfranchise grief for people we hate.
Can part of my grief be dancing?
Yes, it can. Do you know what? Part of it's true though. You know what? It's true though, because part of the framework for recomposing relationships that I built is impact. And that's
Mm.
basically where it just hits your body and you're either full on sobbing. But for impact, I also wrote in that it can include waves of relief and extreme elation, but that's still part of
I
your
mean, that's true.
process.
When my grandmother passed away last year, I mean, but both of my grandmothers, when they died, both died from Alzheimer's and complications thereof. And so that's not a quick death.
No.
It's a slow death, and it's a slow death of a lot of deaths.
Yes, it is.
Um, it's a slow, like you said, that grief is a feeling made of feelings. I mean,
Yeah.
death from slow deaths like that is a death made of deaths, because it's the death of who they were, it's the death of your connection to who they were, it's the death of hope that it will
Yes.
ever get better, it's the
Yeah.
death of yesterday whenever you
Yeah.
thought they recognized you for a few minutes, it's the
Yes.
death, like you're talking about, we die a little bit every day, but watching somebody die of Alzheimer's, or die of a
Oh, yeah.
debilitating, slow illness like that, where
Yeah.
it's coming and there's nothing to reverse it. Our
Yeah.
modern medical science has not come up with a way to reverse that at this point. And when it's coming, there's just so many deaths, and it's years of it. It's
Oh, yeah.
years and years and years of it. And I saw my mother, I mean, just, because she really stood in as sort of the primary, she's not an only child, but she was sort of the primary caregiver there through
Right.
that.
Yeah.
And just, it wasn't relief in the sense of like, oh, thank God, oh, thank God she's dead, because, that's terrible. But it was a relief in the sense of like, she is not suffering, and the very human feeling of, and I can have some kind of my life back. I can have
Yes.
some kind of finality, because, like the way she put it to me, she had grieved the loss of her mother years prior.
Yeah.
She's like, she's been dead for years to me. In the sense of that, the last time that I talked to her and she was her was years ago.
Oh,
And
yeah.
I've been caring for her body since, you know,
Yes.
and that's, yeah, yeah. Sorry.
No, it's very true. And like there's a lot of guilt that comes with that. Like
Mm,
it's the I should be sad. And then,
mm,
we even judge each other in grief. It's like, are you kidding me? You should be more sad about this. Or maybe I should feel anything about this. But it doesn't work like that in our bodies. And that's part of why I built the framework to be different, because it doesn't work like that in our bodies. We can experience all sorts of things. And yes, if you're experiencing elation, if you're experiencing, if you find yourself ecstatic, even for something horrific, you're like,
mm.
why is my body doing this? This isn't normal, but it is.
So we were talking about just sort of, how you process. So what do you do? I mean, so you've been called
Yeah.
bedside, whether it's sudden, whether it's not, and somebody has passed,
Yeah.
the
How do
person
we
that you
do
were
it?
brought in to care for. How do you personally, what do you do with all that energy
What do
that
you
you've
do
got?
with
What do you
it?
do with all of that?
Yeah. You know, uh, again, it's a lot informed by how I came into it. So, how I came
Mhm.
into it, again, not from somebody dying, not from me wanting to make their care better. It was honestly because I got into this industry angry. I,
Mm,
I came into this industry angry. And I came into this industry angry because I've gone through about 20 years of continuous multi source abuse in my
mm,
life. So I've been raped multiple times. I've been sexually assaulted. I've been like no name brand generic harassed. Um, I've been beaten in the streets. I've had parental abuse. I've had domestic violence from partners. I have had, abuse in schools from teachers. I've been through a lot. And through that, a lot of 20 years, which to give you a timeline for everyone listening, I'm currently 31.
mm,
So that's over three-quarters of my life. That's 75% of my life. All right.
mm,
So through this whole thing, I went through a gambit of counselors, school counselors, psychotherapists, therapists, psychologists, self-help books, Reiki sessions, like you name it, trying to find ways. How do I hold the immensity of pain in my body, in my emotions, in my mind? How do I keep doing this thing called life when things keep happening to me? You know, when all these things keep happening in life, and that's not even just the generic horrors of the world that are there, you know, it's a lot. How do I keep holding it? How do I hold a lot was actually my whole journey. How do I hold a lot? And unfortunately for me, you know, I didn't get that help. I found a lot of, you know, fixing, a lot of people trying to tell me what I am, a lot of people trying to look for immediate solutions, a lot of spiritual bypassing, a lot of let's brush it over with silver linings, a lot of the same things that you notice that grievers go through, you know, and that we go through when we're presented with death, at least in the physical sense, which is how we most know it right now. But I want to change that. That's a story for later. I didn't get enough help, and eventually I did commit suicide. Commit suicide. That's not the way to put it. I chose suicide. I chose it because I felt like it was my only choice, and I succeeded. I died, and I had a whole experience in death. And when I guess came back, all of what ended up being literally like a second later, but for me it was a whole experience. That's another thing I could talk about, is that strange NDE experience. There's whole shows. I think there's a Netflix show, Surviving Death, that talks about near-death experiences. That was awesome for me because I'm like, oh my God, I'm not the only one. I had a whole experience.
My husband has had a near-death experience as well, and he's those are conversations he could have forever.
Oh my
forever.
gosh. I would love to talk about it one day. I hope it's in your book.
It is. Well, yes. The short answer is yes.
Yeah. So I came back, and then I was really angry. I spent a good 6 to 8 months being extremely angry at being alive. And during that anger period, that even more angry than before anger period, I went through all the reasons why I was angry and really nailing down all the things I felt were wrong with the system that weren't present in therapy, that weren't present in even trauma-informed therapy. You know, which trauma-informed therapy in these last 5 years especially has gotten amazing. It's gotten much, much, much better. And that's mostly because too many people who have trauma themselves actually became therapists because they're like, fuck this shit, let's change it. And I love that because we're actually getting somewhere with that. But there's still a lot missing in trauma-informed therapy. It's still very fixative, you know, and that's mostly because we're in a system. If you become a therapist, you have to be a part of this system that's so fixative, even in its language. Here's what your treatment plan's going to be. Here's when you know they're done treatment. There's a lot of the DSM-V has so many problems. It's a mess, y'all. It's a mess. You do not need me to tell you, because it is. And anyway, I wrote all those things down, and then I started looking for answers really hard, because I'm like, if I'm going to be alive, I'm going to fucking figure this out. Excuse me again for swearing. I guess I swear when I'm passionate. Fine. I'm sorry. And I tried to find everything. And the first thing that I tried was shadow work. And this was before it was trendy. So calm down, y'all. It was before it was trending. And I thought maybe this is a way for people to be able to meet in difference, for people to be able to hold people like me. Because honestly, I got treated like shit for having trauma. That's another thing that comes with trauma, is that you get treated as if you are a pestilence, a plague, a parasite, because you had shit happen to you, as if it's going to be contagious and rub off on other people around you. And then you get sentences slung at you in this really malicious way: hurt people. And they sling that out at you before they even know it. They just learn that you had some trauma, and they're like, uh-oh, stay away from them. And then it just makes it so that even more people don't get help, because we don't know how to hold the discomfort of death and pain. Point blank, period. So how do we get there? And I thought it was shadow work. And I did these amazing courses that worked really well for this beautiful group of people. And then there came a point with all of them where they really hit a wall. And they couldn't quite get any deeper. They couldn't quite grasp some of the discomfort they had within themselves, within their relationships. And I was like, okay, what's missing from my experience that makes me be able to get there that they can't get there? And I thought the answer might be death, because despite all my years of trauma and despite actually having a near death experience, I also had a really close relationship with death throughout the trauma. Death was never weird to me. Death was kind of this character that was always misunderstood in my life. Some of my first connections with death were like watching Tales from the Crypt and being like, oh my God, maybe death is just this nice storytelling corpse dude who really cares about misfit creatures. Maybe death is, or the Muppets Christmas Carol. Death is this big looming figure that ultimately wants to help you. And maybe they look a little scary, but they're just going to show you something that's going to get you on track. I don't know. I had these very interesting ideas of death that made me a little more open to it from the beginning. And so I decided to explore that further. I'm like, okay, well, did that relationship with death help me at all throughout this trauma to actually like keep going for as long as I could? And like, is there answers there? And so I started researching death really hard and eventually going into end of life doulaship. And then it just hasn't stopped since, because I found it. I found the answers there. I was like, oh shit, how we hold death and grief is the answers. This is where it is. And the answers are in not fixing. Like, when I get in those moments where I'm in a room with other people, the first thing I lean on, and this is the first thing you should lean on, is don't fix it. Because you're going to feel the urge to fix it. So notice the urge in your body that comes right up your throat to fix it, to say something to make it better. And don't say something to make it better. Say something to make it real. Affirm that it's real. Affirm that everything they're experiencing is totally correct and real, because it is. That's the first thing I do. And the second thing I do, again, hierarchies of loss. Is there anything that I feel like is lesser about this loss that's making it hard for me to receive it? And then can I take a quiet moment to myself to really quickly in my brain go, okay, that's a hierarchy. I'm going to put that aside. How do I respond if I put that aside? And the next thing I do is take responsibility for myself, which means I need to know my edges. I need to know when something is too much and I need to leave the room. I need to know as a doula what things I can and can't take on. Like, for example, I know, and I still haven't examined this fully, so I need to actually sit down with this one. I know that I can sit with people who are experiencing pregnancy and child loss and are in post-loss space, post-death space. I actually have lots of people who have been through that as clients right now. But I also know that I could not sit bedside while a child is going through a physical death. That's an edge for me. That is an edge. I can't hold my shit in that situation yet. I still need to go through, where do I want to fix it? Why do I want to fix it? What are my connections? What are my stories? And it honestly probably has a lot to do with the fact that I have a 5-year-old daughter, and my connection to her and how significant she is in my life, because she actually came right after my suicide experience. So there's a big connection there. So there's an edge that I need to explore. So that's a boundary for me. I also need to take responsibility for, and this is where this comes in. Am I trying to get my pain witnessed for a grief in this moment where other people are having a spotlight on their pain? Because sometimes when we do that, I guess it seems like emotional hijacking, where we're like we make it about our story. What that tells us is that there's something about our story of that death or that loss. Maybe there's something about my grandma's death that I actually haven't spent enough time with. And me seeing someone else's experience is poking that again and saying, hey, this needs a little more attention. So that's the moment where you go, okay, I'm noticing that I want to bring this up, which probably means that I need to spend more time with it myself. But if I can notice that I want to bring it up, I can also tuck it away and be like, not right now. I'm going to just be here for their story right now and focus on asking open-ended questions, focus on naming their experience as real, focus on not fixing, because then, And then I can revisit that later when I'm with my doula, when I'm with my grief counselor, therapist, when I'm with my friends.
Hmm. So
Yeah.
you do have someone that you go speak to that
Oh yeah,
you
for me, yeah.
good.
I got a team. Like I have a whole team. I've got everything from dream workers to, you know what, it's really funny because my partner is also a therapist. So,
Good.
and I don't make my partner a therapist for
Good.
everything, but we do have very in-depth conversations because of that. And my partner is actually part of the House of Grief. We formed it together. We're kind of doing this coalition of joining doulaship and therapy together.
Mm.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, just sort of as we wrap up the conversation about some more of the practicalities. I know that you said a big part of your training was in understanding the legalities, both in Canada and in the United States. What
Yeah.
are just some of the most common misconceptions about death legally?
Okay, so some of the common misconceptions about death legally, one of them, depending on where you are, again, this is a thing for where I am in Canada, but it might be different province to province, state to state, is that you don't actually have to have your body filled with formaldehyde if you don't want to. Like you don't have to
Mm-hmm.
go that route. And there are, and like again, like green burial options. There's other burial options. You don't have to have it all done that way. Most people don't know that. They don't actually know that they have choices
Mm-hmm.
with what gets done to their body afterwards. They think that embalming is just like the thing that has to be done, but it's not necessarily true depending on where you are. The other thing that's really big, that's mostly trending because of part of the end of life doulas movement and home death movement, is that you do not have to have your body transported in a hearse. You do not have to die in a hospital and leave your body there and have it in the hospital mortuary. You can actually have your friends come pick it up in a truck and drive you back home, and you can have your body hang out in your house for a few days. Like and here's the thing that people get weirded out for that. Your body isn't going to like poison everybody. Your body's actually not very dirty. With the death thing, like, yes, there will be fluids, there will be stool that will come out. Your body may go into rigor mortis, and rigor mortis is temporary. It actually doesn't last forever. You're not stuck in a stuck position forever. It's only like a thing that happens for, I think, like 1 or 2 days. It's not a big thing. You can have a whole home funeral and like have your body stay in your house for many days, and you can have your family wash it, take care of it if they want to. Again, if they want to, if that's something they're willing to do. And it can be there. You don't have to move right away. You know. And even in a hospital, like having a doula is good for advocate rights so that they're not trying to rush you out of the hospital room and be like, okay, we need to move the body now. You can feel like you can have a doula stand at the door and be like, no, they're going to stay here. They have the right to stay here. You know, like you don't get to rush them out an hour after grandma died, kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So those are some of the legalities that are like really commonly asked about that are really good to know.
Do you personally assist in the preparation of bodies and after the fact, or is that something, do you train families on that?
Doulas mostly train families on do that because there's
Okay.
something really, really important about you actually touching their body.
Mm-hmm.
There's a very powerful experience if you can do it. And sometimes a doula might help you, like, will ask, is it okay if I take your hand and place
Mm-hmm.
it on their body? Because sometimes you might actually need someone to take your hand and help you through that step. It's a really big step. We can walk you through step by step, talk you through how to wash. We can talk you through what to use. We can talk you through even every moment, even when you get really scared. We can put our hands on yours. We can talk you through it. And again, we're not going to do anything without consent. We're not going to push you. A good doula will never push you. Never, ever, ever. We'll just wait. And again, we know how to slow down enough that we will wait as long as it takes with you. So
That
yeah, that's it. We
that
generally
is
coach other people.
That's beautiful. And I just appreciate that, how much control you give not only the dying, but the family, and allow them
Yeah.
to create their own pace and create their own sense of time. Um, Malachi Rose, Mal. I'm just so happy that we could have this conversation. And I'm so happy to raise up the House of Grief and let other people know about it and let other people know about the very important work that you and all of the death doulas out there do. If folks want to learn more about maybe what options they have in their state, are there any specific resources that they could use?
Yeah. So if you're looking for your specific state and your specific province for end of life doulas, it might actually be great for you to go to INELDA. It's INELDA. That's the International uh, End of Life Doula Association, or you can look for your local End of Life Doula associations if you have one. I know in Canada, we do have an End of Life Doula Association for overarching. Not everyone is a part of that, but that's a good place to start for resources. And those are also good places to look up a base ethical code, because even
Mm.
if a doula does not have a certification, you should be able to go ask them about their personal code of ethics and have them draw it up. Just so you know, you know. And look up end of life doulas even on Instagram. Look at who's around you. Start following end of life doulas. Like, this is the greatest place that you can start, is just start following the conversation and get in there. Because so many doulas are talking about death in a bunch of different ways. And again, some of us are rocking the boat, like, and pushing what death work can be. Like, I'm doing it at the House of Grief. I know I'm not the only one. I follow a bunch of other boat rockers, where, House of Grief is now focusing solely, we're not doing bedside care. We are focusing solely on everyday dyers and on getting you connected with death, mortality, change, immense change, questioning what happens if we treat trauma like disenfranchised grief and we instead use grief techniques and death techniques to work with trauma. What happens when we do these things? That's what we're doing at the House of Grief. There you can find so many amazing tools to kind of put in your belt with therapy, with whatever spiritual thing you're doing. It all works together for whatever works for you. Because again, this is about putting the power of the experience of death, the power of death, back in your hands. Because when we put the power of your experience of death back in your hands, we also give you back the power over your own life.
Um, I do want to ask one final question, and it's something that I feel like, no matter what profession you get in, you just, if you're surrounded by it all day, you kind of learn all the weird ins and outs of it. You learn about, peculiar outliers in that field. But your field is death, so I feel like you might have a really interesting answer to this question. How do you want to go out?
How do
How do
I want
you,
to go out?
yeah, how do you do you want to be like skydiving and chugging champagne and just like crash into a waterfall or something, or just like smothered by puppies? Like, what's your favorite death? What do you how you want to go? Or are you one of those, I want to be 117 surrounded by six generations of my fat grandbabies and sitting on my pile of money? Like, what's your favorite death? How do you want to go?
Man, you know what? This one's sometimes hard to think about, because these days I think a lot less about how I want to die and a lot more about how I want to live.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, I once had this vision, because part of my spiritual practice, I am a witch too. So I do some witchy things, and part of my witchy things, I ended up having a fun vision where I was in a hospital, but it was like a nice hospital room. I never thought I'd go out in a hospital or even think about that, because I don't like hospitals. But I was in a hospital room and I was laying down. I had this huge, long white braid of
Mm.
hair, and I looked like I was in a pretty comfy set of jammies. And I was laying there holding the hand of my daughter. And my daughter in this vision was older and was starting to wrinkle herself. And somebody was holding her and had their arms wrapped around her. And I had a really nice view out my window. I had this beautiful view of, like, there was trees and birds and things. And that was a vision of a moment of dying. And I don't know if that's going to come true, But honestly, that would be perfect.
Old and loved and having lived a good life and
Yeah.
seeing some beauty in the world. I love that. That's beautiful. What's your last meal? What's the you got one last, you know it's coming, you can see it a mile away. Who you calling? What's the meal?
Oh my God, my last meal would honestly be sushi. I could eat sushi all day, every day for the whole of my life. So I'm certainly would want it. And I don't care. It can be vegan sushi. It can be something, I just love
Uh-huh.
it. I love
Uh-huh.
sushi. That's the one. And
Do
like,
you
frankly,
do you do the
after that,
ginger? Do you eat the ginger on its own?
oh,
Do you put the ginger on the sushi? I love sushi, but like I'm not like I haven't eaten enough sushi to be like a connoisseur of sushi. I'm just like, put it all on there and just stick it in my mouth, please.
well, that's
I
how
feel
it's
like
supposed
that's
to be.
there's the audio that somebody's gonna cut out.
Yeah, right.
Stick it in my mouth, please. Yeah.
No, it's, what, honestly, isn't that how sushi's supposed to be eaten? That makes me more of
Yes.
a connoisseur because it's supposed to be all in one bite. Like
Just
they're supposed to actually have the soy sauce and the wasabi and
yes,
everything
please.
all ready to go. You know? Yeah, I don't generally eat the ginger, actually. I'm not a big pickled ginger fan. But
I put it on the roll and then I eat it because somebody told me like that's what you're supposed to do. And I don't know why, but I don't think it makes any difference whatsoever. Mel, thank you so much for being here. I'm so glad that we finally got to have this
we did
conversation and
it.
we powered through all of the various technical difficulties. If folks want to connect with you online, how can they do that?
If folks want to connect with me online, they can go at Mahlakai Rose on Instagram. That's where I am most often these days. And you can also go at the House of Grief on Instagram. And though our page is currently, I don't know, by the time this podcast airs, we might be up and running, but we're under construction because we are totally changing the structure of our business over and doing something really weird and different.
Yay.
So I'm excited to get that up this year. We have a lot of cool workshops coming up, like what to do when you're hitting rock bottom. I want to have a workshop about, I'm calling it consensual rock bottoming. It's this hilarious practice of how to hit the hardest moments in a way where you can play when you don't want to play. And it's yeah, there's lots of cool things happening over there. So please find us there. Find us there.
Find them there. Thank you so much. You have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Once again, my thanks goes out to Mahlakai Rose, my very special guest for this episode. Please go check them out on social media as well as the House of Grief. They are doing great work. If you like Head on Fire and you want to support it, there are a number of ways to help. Consider sharing the show with your friends online. You can also like or rate the show 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, and while you're there, leave a review. Reviews help recommend the show to other listeners just like you. You could also help keep the show free and producing regularly by joining my Patreon on a monthly basis. Patrons receive additional audio and video content, as well as archived episodes, a private Discord server, and a monthly book club. This month, we are reading The Ghost by Susan Owens. Sign up at patreon.com/headonfirepod. You can also connect with me on most forms of social media at headonfirepod. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, grief is a feeling made of feelings.